Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Barsanti. I am the Edwin Wolf II, Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and it is my great pleasure to again welcome you to tonight's Fireside Chat. Fireside Chats are a series that the Library Company started, so long ago at the beginning of the COVID experience as a way of connecting our audience to our scholars. A way of continuing our programming online that we were doing in person. And it's been all through this time, it's been a really wonderful way to hear about the research that's done at the Library Company, to hear from us, some of our scholars, some of our former fellows, and even some great scholars who weren't former fellows, but who want to tell us more about 18th and 19th century America. Tonight, we're joined by Professor Daniel Mandell from Truman State University, who's going to be talking about his recent book, The Lost Tradition of Economic Equality in America. This is a fascinating subject. I'm not going to talk about Daniel's work before he does, but I can just speak for myself and say that, you know, my assumption heading into before encountering this work was that conversations about economic equality were mostly grounded in the 20th century, either, the economic disparities of the Gilded Age that some say we're seeing reprised now, but that a discussion of economic equality in the early period of the United States is something I've never really seen discussed. So I'm really eager to hear Professor Mandell's presentation. I'm sure you are too. Quick bio. Professor Mandell is a professor of history at Truman State University, which is a liberal arts state college in Northeast Missouri. He teaches early America, Native American history, and the history of law in America. He earned his PhD at the University of Virginia in 1992, and also a master's in environmental policy from Tufts University in 1989. Professor Mandell has received various fellowships and awards, including a Mellon Fellowship at the Library Company in 2008, where he started the research that resulted in his book called The Lost Tradition. Before focusing on the tradition of economic equality in America, he wrote a dozen articles and 6 books on Native Americans in New England, including Tribe, Race History, Native Americans in Southern New England from 2008, King Philip's War, Behind the Frontier, Indians in 18th century Eastern Massachusetts. Being a native of Eastern Massachusetts, I'm going to make sure I track that one down because I would really love to know more. Anyway, Professor Mandell, thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I actually just ushered one of my cats out the door. And thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you all for attending tonight, for your interest in my book, my topic. I deeply appreciate the Library Company's support in hosting my talk tonight and providing that Mellon Fellowship that got me digging into the idea of equality in America. And actually, they also hosted the NEH Research Seminar in the summer of 2011, where colleagues gave me the green light to focus on economic concerns and actually suggested the title for the work as well. So there are deep connections between the Library Company and this work. Tonight, I'm going to focus on the core of the work during the founding period of the United States, with the flowering of the belief that their republic depended on a rough economic equality, and that the individual accumulation of great wealth would corrupt government, societies, and morals. As you'll see in my slideshow, through the early republic, I include images of pieces of the publications that I'm quoting, so you can glimpse the artifact and see, as well as hear the words. As I breeze more quickly through developments after 1800, you'll see fewer illustrations and more text as signposts. I look forward to your questions and more discussion at the end. I began thinking about these questions in 2005, when the widening gulf between rich and poor in the United States and the world more generally was becoming a major public concern. Few writers in newspapers and periodicals considered the history of the issue, and those that did, at best, went back only to the Gilded Age. But I knew from past research that one should go back at least as far as the American Revolution, with a widespread belief that a republic required a rough equality of property. I also knew during Reconstruction, Congress had rejected distributing land to penniless freedmen while extending the vote and civil rights. And I wondered what had happened between the Revolution and Reconstruction to that tradition of economic equality. So with those matters in mind, I decided to research and write this book. My greatest surprise was finding that this American tradition actually originated in 17th century England. The seeds emerged from the Radical Reformation and then blossomed during England's Civil War in the 1640s, first with the London Levelers, and then in a more radical economic form with the Diggers, led by William Everard and Gerald Winstanley, who set up communes. And as you can see in this, this publication and their speech to one of the gentry in England that was published, condemned private landholding as men's original sins. A secular version, grounded in ancient Rome's agrarian laws, entered English political discourse through James Harrington's Commonwealth of Oceania, published 1656, that envisioned a prosperous republic grounded on a constitution that gave land to all and placed a limit on wealth. 3 decades later, John Locke's two treatises of government argued, like the Levelers, that, quote, all men by nature are equal. And like the Diggers, that all men by nature, like the Diggers argued that labor rather than title gave value to land. Now, these writers were hugely influential among literate Americans. In fact, John Adams pointed to Harrington's book when emphasizing that power and property are interwoven. And if you look at the upper right corner of this title page, I hope you can see that this is Adams' own copy, now held by the Boston Public Library. You can see a digital copy on archive.org if you'd like. Looking at the century between Locke and the American Revolution, I was fascinated to find that Native Americans became the symbol of economic equality. In England, Native peoples became a strong symbol of social and economic equality. Locke wrote, for example, that in, quote, in the beginning, all the world was America, unquote, where private property did not exist. More significantly, in America, the vast lands taken from Native peoples by British colonists provided a far higher level of economic and therefore political equality than across the Atlantic. That's a fairly deep irony. On the east side of the Atlantic, indigenous Americans became symbols of equality, while on this side, Anglo-Americans hated or scorned natives, but actually approached a rough economic equality by taking their land and resources. Now, the older British ideas and the reality of relative economic equality compared to Europe would shape American responses as wars and imperial reforms increasingly roiled the colonies. In the late 1740s, as Boston confronted poverty and political tensions, Samuel Adams published the Independent Advertiser for the town's artisans and laborers. A January 1748 edition, which I excerpt here, reprinted segments of the British radical series Cato's Letters, including the charge that liberty required equality, and equality required the community to place limits on the wealth held by individuals when it became a danger to the public. That idea became embedded in American responses to imperial reforms like the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties. In 1773, New Haven minister Benjamin Trumbull emphasized in his official sermon to the newly elected Connecticut governor and legislators the need for Republican governments to have the power to keep property as equally divided among the inhabitants as possible. 1 year later, the First Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, organized a boycott against the coercive acts and called for committees to be formed in every town and county to enforce the measure and to prevent price gouging by wealthy merchants and farmers. Now, more radical currents emerged as the colonies moved to open revolt. This was particularly apparent in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where conservatives resisted independence until May 1776, at which point revolutionary committees in Philadelphia took the reins with Congress's blessing and organized elections for a state constitutional convention. Privates in the city's militia published a broadside, which I excerpt here, urging voting for middling farmers and artisans who would forge a more egalitarian government because, quote, great and overgrown rich men will be too apt to be framing distinctions in society that they would personally gain from. Their campaign was successful, with radicals like Thomas Paine and Thomas Young elected to the meeting. At one point, the convention debated a proposal, possibly Ben Franklin's idea, that would have given the legislature the power to take excessive property from individuals on the principle that concentrations of wealth were, quote, a danger to the happiness of mankind. That proposal did not pass. But the final product was far more democratic than the constitutions written by other states. For example, voters and office holders were not required to own property, only to pay taxes. During the Revolution, these egalitarian ideas became embedded in the widespread effort to control prices. Empowered by the Continental Congress beginning in 1774, local committees of safety not only demanded oaths of allegiance to the new governments and a nation, but also regulated trade. That effort widened in early 1777. After a meeting of New England delegates agreed on an extensive set of price guidelines to, quote, prevent monopoly and oppression. Notice the title of this particular, of this broadside. To be expanded and enforced by states. The states passed enabling legislation that in turn, as in Massachusetts, told town committees of safety to extend and enforce those limits. Those committees in many towns, as in the bustling shipbuilding center of Newburyport, as you can see here, printed up lists of regulated items and posted the broadsides around town in newspapers. When Congress received the news, it applauded and called for other regions in the new nation to do the same. Americans viewed market regulation as more than just a wartime measure. In mid-May, committees of safety in Plymouth County, Massachusetts met and agreed to tighten enforcement. The resolutions that they passed began with a nod to the Diggers' principle that, quote, an equitable exchange of the fruits of the earth in due proportion to that of another is the basis on which felicity, freedom, and the happiness of a community greatly depend. Townspeople enthusiastically enforced regulation. In mid-1777, Abigail Adams reported to her husband 2 incidents in Boston. I don't know if you can read Abigail's writing, but this is her report of the April 21st incident, in which 500 people carted 5 price gouging visiting merchants, dumped the miscreants in Roxbury under threat of death if they returned. The disciplined crowd was led by a mounted man preparing the semi-mythical figure of Joyce Jr., famous in Puritan history for capturing Charles I. 3 months later, a large crowd of women, angered by a merchant's price gouging and hoarding, broke into the store. This is Thomas Boylston's store, took coffee and sugar to the market, sold it by the pound at what they considered the just price, and threatened any who tried to stop them. Similar crowd actions were reported from Salem and other northern towns. And indeed, the notion of a just price actually goes way back in British history. It was commonly enforced in towns throughout English history and to some extent in the colonies as well. So they're building on this older tradition. But conflicts over the regulations quickly developed. Some towns opposed the regulations as ineffective and ultimately destructive. Instead, they blamed the increasing circulation of state promissory notes, which acted as currency, as the cause of inflation. Farmers and artisans accused each other of avoiding or violating the regulations. In May 1777, as those committees of safety met in Plymouth County, a writer in the Connecticut Courant argued, as you can see here, that those price regulations, quote, infringe the principles of liberty for which we are gloriously fighting. This is literally the first example that I found of the argument that the revolution's goals included an individual's right to control property free from community regulation. The continued increase of prices drove a call for new regional meetings at the end of July. And that meeting in New England, which at that point included New York, agreed to end regulations and instead called for reducing inflation by recalling those promissory notes through increased taxation. Although support for the controls did remain strong, and Congress in November 1777 issued a new call for regional regulatory meetings, those New England states did go ahead and repealed their regulatory laws, and other states failed to take such measures. Basically, they decided it just didn't work. With the arrival of French forces, renewed inflation drove another wave of regulation in America, beginning this time in Philadelphia in the summer of 1779. On May 25th, a huge crowd voted to investigate Robert Morris and other merchant price gougers, push prices back to January 1779 levels, encourage other towns to do the same. They also elected a committee to handle these matters and field future complaints. This was followed by a massive meeting that there were some merchants that were arrested for violating rules of just prices and were marched off to prison. This is a big deal. This involved the entire town, and a lot of anger was involved. This movement indeed spread farther, as far south as Williamsburg, and north, yes, again, to Boston. In Boston, the city called for a state meeting to which 151 towns in Massachusetts sent delegates, Concord, Massachusetts, passed a set of regulations to be expanded and enforced by individual towns. So it didn't involve the legislature at all. But in the meantime, as towns began to pass these rules and to enforce them, back in Philadelphia, merchants and artisans in Philadelphia publicly scorned the measures in a series of open letters. And you can follow this in newspapers from the time. One of the articles in one of the newspapers asserted that price controls had created, quote, greater restraints and abridgments of natural liberty than the hated imperial measures that had led to the revolution. So the rhetoric starts to get pretty intense. The city's regulatory committee actually published these objections along with their reply in a September 1779 edition of the Pennsylvania Packet. A small snippet is here. The reply rejected the liberal assertions as contrary to the common good. They noted that there had always been this kind of regulation, right? But they went even farther to assert in proto-Marxist terms, I don't know if you could, it's visible text, that the laborers who had built the ships were due not only their pay, but had a vested interest in the goods that the vessels carried, and therefore the prices on those goods could be regulated by the public as a whole. Yet, although broad wage and price regulation continued to be supported by many states and towns, their failure in practical terms finally led the states and Congress to reject them by the beginning of 1780. These conflicts over commerce and currency generated a growing sense that control of capital, in addition to land, really, could become a source of inequality and oppression. This was a new thought, a new idea. The Connecticut Courant in December 1777 charged, quote, fat and nasty farmers and merchants with buying up state bills of credit, and predicted that after the war, those same monopolists would force laws taxing the underpaid mechanics and laborers to repay those notes, sparking a bloody uprising. And it seems like a remarkable prediction of the causes and results of Shays' Rebellion 9 years down the road. But the wartime experience also fostered, at the same time, the liberal vision of individual economic freedom that would become increasingly dominant even as towns continued to regulate prices of beer, bread, ferries, tavern fees, and other necessaries. Also, Americans continued to strongly believe in the need to maintain economic equality and guard against corrupting concentrations of wealth. As Americans achieved independence, they wrote and argued about the future of their new country. While those who were white generally believed that they lived in the most egalitarian conditions in the world, they were concerned about how wealth might reshape and corrupt the infant republic. As a result, nearly every significant issue, from ending slavery to national pensions for continental officers to repaying the war debt, would be debated in terms of class conflict, with an emphasis either on solidifying a weak hierarchy in order to ensure social stability, or ensuring that Republican government would rest on ordinary Americans. Interesting, but rarely noted today, is that in the only recorded public debate over a new state constitution, that of Massachusetts, one widespread objection was to its maintenance of the English tradition of requiring voters and office holders to own property. But clearly, the most widespread and bitter conflicts erupted over chartering corporations, mainly to build roads or establish banks. On the first day of 1790, the Politician wrote in the Massachusetts Magazine that, quote, "an unequal distribution of wealth," unquote, would cause the final ruin of a nation, as it created bitter divisions, discouraged or barred those without property from gaining an education, and created the danger of a single independent fortune. Perhaps the best way to prevent this great evil, the writer thought, would be to refuse to create corporations, as those would inevitably enrich a few. 3 years later, thousands of Pennsylvanians signed petitions in English and in German, demanding that the legislature not grant a charter to a company to build roads and canals in the state, expressing great anxiety about the power given to corporations to take and control property. As I highlight in the petition here, the inequality introduced by such establishments must destroy the liberties of our country. No observation is better supported than this, that a country cannot long preserve its liberty where a great inequality of property takes place. Is it not, therefore, the most dangerous policy in this infant republic to combine the wealthy in order to make them more powerful? Some urged more active measures to maintain the new nation's essential socioeconomic equality. Thomas Jefferson and Robert Yates of New York discussed, but did little to enact, progressive taxes on large land holdings, especially on unused acreage. Thomas Paine urged an agrarian justice, the title page is here, an estate tax of 10% to create a fund to give every person 15 pounds at birth, at age 21, and annual pensions of 10 pounds to every person beginning at age 50. Some urged agrarian laws that, like the one proposed for the Pennsylvania Constitution, would allow state governments to seize and redistribute the property of overly rich individuals. In 1783, the South Carolinian author of Rudiments of Law and Government argued that society owed individuals a natural right of due proportions of common property, quoted Cato's letters that, quote, "an equality of estate will give an equality of power," and urged the United States to maintain a rough equality by keeping individuals from gaining excessive wealth and power. Later that year, on the day of Thanksgiving celebrating the Treaty of Paris, John Murray, a Presbyterian minister of Newburyport, preached a sermon warning of a future when government had lost its energy and laws their force, when the Confederation is weakened or broken, the Union dissolved. When the Confederation is weak, when the constitutions of particular states corrupted, when agrarian laws cannot be obtained or must pass unexecuted, when individuals are permitted to purchase or possess such enormous tracts of land as may gradually work them up to an influence dangerous to the liberty of the state. A few men, like Connecticut Assemblyman John Welton in 1787, actually called for a biblical jubilee. That's in Deuteronomy and in some other Jewish writings, sacred writings, that every 50 years, all servants would be set free, all debts canceled, and all property returned to the original owners. And by the way, that's the clause that is embossed on the Liberty Bell, Deuteronomy. The resistance and demands for reforms in Shays' rebellion made many elites fear a revived push to appropriate the lands of the better sort and end private property. After the uprising, New Hampshire Representative William Plummer told a friend that 200 farmers besieging the State House and demanded equal distribution of property. Henry Knox in Massachusetts told George Washington in a letter similar things about the Shayites. The notorious upheaval influenced the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. As the meeting ended, Hamilton told his fellow delegates that he expected the new US Constitution would earn, quote, the goodwill of most men of property, since it would protect them against domestic violence and the depredations which the democratic spirit is apt to make on property. In 1790, John Adams was still thinking of the uprising when he told Richard Price, too many Americans pant for equality of persons and property. So democracy of economic democracy and political democracy was seen as two sides of the same coin. In comparison, altering inheritance laws to break up large estates, which was also considered an agrarian law, gained wide support and effusive praise. Thomas Jefferson is particularly famous for this movement. He did introduce October 1776 a bill that nearly ended entail in Virginia, and 9 years later sponsored the measure that ended intestate primogeniture, where all the land goes to the oldest son if there is no will left. North Carolina required intestate partible inheritance. All the land gets divided among all the sons. Delaware declared that, quote, it is the duty and policy of every Republican government to preserve equality amongst its citizens by maintaining the balance of property. By the end of the century, nearly every state had intestate laws. What happens to property if you die without a will? Mandating equal division of the estates. The problem with this was that wealthy men could still write wills, leaving all of their property to one person. So that didn't end the conglomeration of estates and passage of the land across the generations. It only put the weight of the state behind dividing it if there was no will left. In addition, this focus on land, of course, completely ignored the increasingly significant role of capital in the new nation's economy. Aside from the end of entail, the most substantive egalitarian push may have been to limit the size, or the call to limit the size of individual purchases of federal lands. In 1785, Congress had created a system to organize, survey, and sell federal lands for at least $2 an acre. That required, given the minimum size that you could buy at auction, at least $1,280 in cash to get into the land game. Now that's far more than your average farmer could afford. As a result, in the 1790s, as US troops forced Native Americans to abandon more of their lands, 18,500 square miles in all during that decade, loud voices demanded that measures be adopted to ensure widespread ownership and prevent the monopolization of the land by wealthy speculators. They also pushed successfully, actually, for land to be sold on credit, which ironically would help drive the panics of 1819 and 1837. The vicious irony is that the greatest egalitarian potential in the new country, the land and its resources, depended on dispossessing Native communities that had more egalitarian societies, cultures, and economies than did contemporary Americans. So even as Americans argued over the details, it's clear that a tradition of economic equality flourished during the American Revolution and became a foundational principle of the United States at its founding. That tradition, which had first developed in 17th century England, held that a rough relative equality of property ownership was required in a republic, and that the accumulation of great wealth by individuals would inevitably corrupt the new nation's polity. That principle helped sweep Thomas Jefferson and his allies into control of the national government in 1800. But what happened to the tradition during the 19th century, which takes up the next 5 chapters of my book? Quick summation. During the subsequent half century, of course, the nation's economy, society, and culture shifted dramatically. Perhaps the least significant change was that men wore pants instead of knee breeches. Perhaps the most significant were huge shifts in the nation economy, with the growing significance of wage labor and capital instead of land as a source of wealth and power. An important and underlying part of that change was the increasing acceptance by Americans of economic inequality as a normal condition in the republic. I point to several causes for that acceptance. First, the stories written by English gentry, republished in the United States for the rising generations of American children, that taught them and their parents to embrace a stable, hierarchical society where the poor accepted their lot and cherished the wealthy and powerful. Second, merchants and their elite allies increasingly embraced and even celebrated unregulated rights to property and capital, abandoning older concerns about luxury and greed. These new views of political economy also originated in England, with Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo arguing that it was scientific and necessary that poor laborers would suffer and the wealthy become richer. And this illustration, this book cover you see here is actually supposedly a children's book written by this woman, Jane Marcet, in England, that it's 400 pages full of stuff from Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo, supposedly for children. Tough sledding, but amazing for a historian to read through. Third, states ended property limitations on the right to vote and the right to hold office. Those democratic reforms that were hotly debated at the time are usually celebrated today, even as we condemn the replacements by racial barriers because it became white men who could vote instead of men with property. But we don't talk about the fact that this severed the longstanding connection between political and economic equality and had the effect of inculcating, of isolating public life and politics against efforts to mitigate the rapidly widening divide between rich and poor. But while the tradition of economic equality seemed increasingly marginalized, it remained a significant part of American culture. As mass production, along with investment and speculation, became major parts of the economy, fears grew that the wealthy few would corrupt the country. Publisher William Duane in Philadelphia and other radical Jeffersonians loudly insisted that private property had to give way to the public good to maintain the happy medium of property and condition. The Panic of 1819 drove many wage workers into deep poverty. And what emerged from it was a critique of new capitalism grounded in the older egalitarian tradition and the development of what has become known as the working man's movement. Philadelphia shoemaker William Hyton, 1826, wrote a constitution for the city's infant mechanic association that condemned the unequal and very excessive accumulation of wealth and power as the cause of their misery. In New York, machinist Thomas Skidmore published The Rights of Man to Property, cover of the book you see here, highlighting community consent as the source of property rights and calling for the state of New York to redistribute all property and in the future take all wealth at death. And then in an echo of Thomas Paine's agrarian justice, redistributed to men and women at the age of 18. He also organized a huge public gathering of working men in the city that enthusiastically adopted a manifesto calling for every person to be given an equal amount of property upon adulthood, taxation of churches, and other radical measures. Between 1828 and 1834, working men's parties mushroomed throughout the United States, all condemned the moneyed aristocracy and sought various social and economic reforms. In some ways, the language of class conflict was a noticeable shift from the 18th century, when Americans tended to celebrate Republican consensus. Although their call for a rough equality of property to avoid corrupting the Republic echoed the national consensus of the early Republic. This working man's movement was co-opted by the surging Democratic Party and then crushed by the crash of 1837. But as America began to recover from the crash, egalitarian ideals again surged. As America agonized over the rising tide of excessive wealth flaunted by an elite class and the increasingly obvious poverty suffered by many. A noticeable number of Americans joined a communitarian movement that initially held a religious emphasis, the Shakers. But in the early 1840s, Albert Brisbane returned from France and implemented an American version of the ideas of Charles Fourier, an early French socialist, establishing humanitarian farms and workshops. By 1846, there were Fourier groups in cities and settlements, including the famous transcendentalist commune Brook Farm, showed here in this painting. Probably more important was a National Reform Association formed in 1844 in New York City by former working men's movement activists. The NRA called for a 10-hour day for laborers and a homestead law, the right of any American to be allowed to claim up to 160 acres for free with lifetime tenure, not permanent. They couldn't, after they died, the property would go back to then go to someone else. The property would be laid out in townships around a town square, and no one would be allowed to own more than 160 acres. The NRA built strong alliances with labor and communalist organizations and actually became very influential, gained endorsements from newspapers around the country, including Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. But in the 1850s, the rise of the slavery issues doomed the movement, although Congress did enact a Homestead Act in 1862. Now, it's worth noting that both the Fourierists and the NRA spurned calls for redistribution, and they never really warned about capitalists. So that by the 1840s, Americans rarely talked about how the concentration of wealth in the few would corrupt the Republic, probably because there was this huge concentration of wealth in so many hands at that point. The marginalization of that American tradition became clear with Congress's unwillingness to confiscate and redistribute plantation land to freedmen during Reconstruction. Not long after the Civil Wars erupted, Republicans considered measures to free human and landed property from Confederate leaders. They condemned concentrated wealth and corrupt power, but solely in terms of those Southern trader plantation owners. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens thundered, "The whole fabric of Southern society must be changed in order to eliminate its features of aristocracy and make it a true republic." As the United States Army brought emancipation to growing swaths of the South and plantation owners fled, freedmen began to insist on the right to farm where they worked and had been tormented for generations without pay. In the wake of the 13th Amendment ending slavery, Congress empowered the new Freedmen's Bureau to rent up to 40 acres to freedmen at very low rates. And in the occupied Southeast coast, General Sherman provided Black families with 40-acre allotments from lands abandoned by Confederate owners. That summer, word spread among freedmen throughout the South that Lincoln and the Freedmen's Bureau would usher in the Great Jubilee by confiscating rebel-owned plantations and giving each of them a 40-acre parcel. But Lincoln had been assassinated. By the fall, President Andrew Johnson was pushing for the return of land to the former rebels. Stevens and Senator Charles Sumner and a few other radicals continued to push for confiscation and redistribution. But Congress as a whole refused because most trusted in wage labor and the free market and chose to extend only civil rights and the vote. While clearly racism was a factor, their decision also highlighted the assumption that political power and economic power were two distinct things, and showed that the American tradition of economic equality, which had viewed economics and politics as indivisible, had been supplemented by an ideology of sacred private property and virtuous wage labor. Until the 1800s, Americans assumed that a citizen needed economic independence in order to exercise his proper political role in a virtuous republic. But by the end of the Civil War, they overwhelmingly believed that the nation only needed to vote. So, skipping to the last slide. Does this mean that the American tradition of economic equality was extinct? Not completely. Its continued potency would be demonstrated by Henry George's Progress and Poverty, and his populist movement, the industrial workers of the world, who echoed Thomas Skidmore and the working man's movement and the International Communist Movement, and the ratification of the amendment creating a national income tax that finally offered the means to redistribute capital wealth and reduce economic inequality. The shock of the Great Depression not only recharged the Socialist Party, but spawned the New Deal, next slide, which was designed to rebuild the nation's economy, in part by reducing the yawning chasm between rich and poor, including the regulation of prices and wages. But all of these efforts and more were stalled, marginalized, blocked. And by the end of the 21st century, next slide, even as Americans became increasingly concerned about the rising tide of economic inequality, with the Occupy Wall Street movement and proposals for wealth taxes, few remembered the long history of these concerns in this country. My hope is that my book will help revive this American tradition. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mandell. Again, that's just a fascinating presentation of a sort of a line of historical thinking that I think has been largely lost. Yeah. We have a good group of people out there. Let me encourage you again, if you have a question, I can't see you. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Second best would be to use the chat, but the first thing would be to use the Q&A function to ask a question. While people are thinking up their questions, maybe I can just ask you a sort of naive question, which is to talk a little bit about how this trend of thinking about equality would map onto the sort of the Jeffersonian Democrats and the Federalists of the early federal period. You think this might be this kind of the strong agrarian tendencies of some, like, is this an agrarian trend of thought that we could associate more with the Jeffersonian Democrats? How do these ideas play into that sort of Democrat Federalist debate?
The answer is basically yes, at the risk of ironing over a lot of complexities, right? Because the agrarian idea that the United States should be a nation of independent landowners is obviously very closely connected to this longstanding tradition. And clearly, Federalists were much more likely to be sympathetic towards, thinking of particularly Hamilton and actually Abigail Adams, much more sympathetic towards investment in capital, seeing that as a source of national strength and the path to the nation's future. I tell my students, I actually wind up bringing this in all my classes, that there is this, comes from the Scottish Enlightenment, this idea of 4 stages of human civilization, from hunter-gatherer to pastoralists, sheepers, to farmers, to commerce, and the stages of human development go along with that. Jefferson was really into the farming thing, and obviously it's hard to square these older ideas of economic equality with free capital markets and accumulation of capital, which was Hamilton's vision for the future of the United States. There were no taxes on capital at the time, no income taxes, no wealth taxes. It's interesting how the United States continued to be, shall we say, imprisoned by that assumption that only land could be taxed, that only things, physical things could be taxed, and there are reasons for that. But it took us until the early 20th century to start taxing wealth. So yeah, I would say that does map in, along the Jeffersonian versus Federalist axis.
One of the names that didn't pop up in your talk, unless I missed it, was Adam Smith. And of course, we're accustomed to thinking of Adam Smith as the patron saint of capitalism in many ways. Obviously, there's more to Smith than that.
Yeah.
But do you see in this? I think part of what I'm understanding as part of your answer to that question, as part of your presentation, was that part of what made one of the forces that pushed against this idea of equality of wealth was the increasing complexity of the world of capital, and of a capital-fueled economy as opposed to an agrarian economy. But where does the wealth of nations, how does that work, or is that a work that had an obvious place in this argument?
The irony, of course, is that it's published in England in 1776, right, the year of the Declaration of Independence. However, Americans aren't reading it and talking about it until pretty much the end of the Revolution, 1780s. So it's not influential on the revolution itself. The ideas, of course, Smith's ideas, I actually did read Wealth of Nations as I was starting work on this project. Smith's ideas did not come out of nowhere. The whole Scottish Enlightenment writings, so a lot of which get echoed in, of course, his, had been batted around for decades, a few decades before the revolution, and were influential. Certainly Adam Smith is sold, quoted, used, but what got to me actually is when you start seeing American writers in the late 1790s, early 1800s, justifying being as wealthy as possible, and that there should be no limits on the amount of wealth a person should hold, that was virtuous, that was a good thing, right? They're not quoting or citing Adams, and the ideas that they're reflecting are much more Ricardo and Malthus, who actually, Ricardo and Malthus had also, this is actually one of these kind of amazing discoveries. For me, I had no idea. As I'm reading through this, and I'm also looking at the references to Malthus and Ricardo, they had set up shop in London to lobby Parliament to pass laws that would put their vision essentially for the economy into effect, right? And their writings are being reprinted by American presses. And then they find their ways into this literature like Jane Marcet's book, which is truly bizarre. 400 pages where a mother is telling her daughter that the daughter wants to help the poor, and the mother says, no, 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 that's a bad idea. It rots their brains and it ruins the economy. And as Mercado says, this blah, 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 blah. And as Malthus says, blah, 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 blah. And it goes on and on for 400 pages. It's just like, oh my God, this is supposed to be for children. But it's reprinted by American publishers, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. So they must have sold them.
Yeah. I mean, I also start to think about, like, you know, you read these days about, I know I get this term wrong, but this idea of a kind of prosperity theology, right? And the idea of a sort of trend in certain branches of evangelical Christianity around the idea that wealth is an indicator of virtue. Wealth is a sign of God's blessing. And then you can, it sounds like a little bit of what you're beginning to trace here has that kind of religious element to the accumulation of wealth. And that part of a kind of American religious picture is also, I think, a trend of thought that feeds into what you're describing.
Yes. Of course, that idea that God's favor is shown by wealth goes back to the Calvinists, right? But Calvinists regarded that, I think, very differently, right? It was completely, in essence, a matter of luck, God's will. And you were supposed to share that with the community, with those who were less fortunate, because it wasn't that the poor were born or were somehow bad or scuzzy, you know. They had bad luck. Yes, they may have gotten drunk or something, but everyone gets drunk occasionally, right? These are human sins, and the poor are prey to the same human sins as the wealthy are. Okay, and so for that reason, call it luck, call it, you know, God's whatever. You owe the poor something. You owe the community something back. What begins to shift when you have Malthus and Ricardo is the wealthy don't own the poor, don't own the poor anything. We're getting into the Christmas Carol territory, and you know, what's his name? Cratchit's boss.
Scrooge.
We're getting into Scrooge territory.
What is Scrooge?
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned the religious thing, and one, I didn't even mention him, but the president of Brown College writes a book. It's actually a collection of his lectures, and he is a Baptist minister. Okay, he's in charge of. He's the minister at the largest Baptist church in Providence, Rhode Island, and he's the president of Brown University. And his name at the moment is, I can't call on it, but you know, give me. I'll remember after we get off the line here. In his writings, his published writings, his lectures to these college students, this is what he's saying: that the wealthy have wealth because God wants them to have it, and they shouldn't give to the poor because it's bad for the poor. If you give help, if you give money to the poor, then it corrupts them. Then they won't work, et cetera, et cetera. So this is kind of I would say this is a new idea. And I don't see that in Adam Smith. I do see it in Ricardo and Malthus, and I see it in this literature coming out of Americans that echo those two.
Yeah. You know, the thought of, you know, the sort of the Malthusian, the Ricardo and I having a sort of a literature background, I skip immediately to Jonathan Swift and, you know, Modest Proposal to that. A question has come in from an anonymous attendee. Did Paine's argument for an estate tax and universal basic income get any traction with the public, or did he remain known only for rights of man and common sense?
Actually, by that point, he was already becoming infamous. By the time it gets to the United States, actually, let me backtrack a second. Did it get traction? Yes. There are copies being advertised and sold in American bookstores and by American printers after it is published. So it gets traction in that people are reading it, and I've seen references to it. Okay, not a lot, but some references to it. Did it actually cause anything to happen? No. Did Paine become more famous because of it? I don't think so. Paine actually becomes infamous because of that religious thing he wrote shortly thereafter, not Rights of Man. Someone can help me with this one. It's been a long day. He writes another book that just drives American ministers batty. And that's where he becomes known, particularly in the United States, as an atheist, as, you know, the devil's spawn. And that's why when he comes back to the United States, and probably because it followed on agrarian justice in part. But he comes to the United States and he's kind of an outlaw. He has a core of people who agree with him, free thinkers, and there's been some interesting books about this hostility to organized religion that does exist at the time in the United States. But the overwhelming view of Paine by the time he comes back to the United States, having barely escaped his life from the French Revolution, is that you know, he is this really awful agent that has spawned the devil.
The unforgivable sin of atheism.
Yes.
A question came in through the chat. I'm going to read to you. It's in it from a sort of takes a different direction. The questioner asks, you know, going back to Skidmore, I'm curious about the racial politics of him and his supporters, as his economic politics seem to mirror what some are calling for today. Can you elaborate on his notion of community for community consent?
Yeah. It's a good question. The working man's movement generally is emerging at a time when racism is really has developed in cities, and Black workers have already, by the time you get into the 1820s, 1830s, they've been squeezed. They have or are being squeezed out of skilled positions. And yet the working men's literature, like Rights of Men, I'm trying to think, I can't think of any explicitly or even implicitly racial lines drawn by that work. I may be wrong. I'd have to go back and take another look at it. But that movement was pretty egalitarian, at least in the literature that I have seen coming out of it. It's a good question, but I'm not seeing it in that literature.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, Professor Mandell, we have reached the end of our hour. I just want to thank you again for coming and talking to us and sharing your work, which, you know, I think it's always fascinating, especially for those of us who are at the library company, to see what comes out of the research that's done there.
I just remembered that name of that Baptist minister who was president, of course, Francis Wayland.
Francis Wayland.
There you go.
Perfect. Anyway, thank you again. And thank all of you for coming to tonight's Fireside Chat. We have another one coming up next week. The chat has been helpfully chipping in with some of the information about next week's chat. I will hope to see you then. And thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
See you again soon. Thank you.